A racist teacher named Mrs. Andrews humiliates a black student, Sammy, in front of the entire class, breaking his spirit. Years later, Sammy Holland returns to school as an unexpected success. What happened at the reunion will leave you in tears. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Sammy Holland bounced into Mrs. Andrews' classroom, his backpack swinging and his eyes shining with excitement. It was the first day of 4th grade, and he couldn't wait to learn new things, especially in math. He loved numbers and how they danced in his head. "Good morning, class," Mrs. Andrews said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Find your seats, please." Sammy plopped down at a desk near the front, eager to soak up every word. He pulled out his notebook and pencil, ready to dive in. As Mrs. Andrews began the lesson on multiplication tables, Sammy's hand shot up again and again. He knew the answers and wanted to share. 7 times 8 is 56, he called out proudly when Mrs. Andrews pointed to him. But instead of praise, Mrs. Andrews' lips tightened. "Sammy, we raise our hands and wait to be called on in this class. You're disrupting the others." Sammy's cheeks burned. He hadn't meant to be a bother. He just loved math so much. During group work, Sammy eagerly shared his ideas with his table mates. But Mrs. Andrews came over, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Sammy, dear, why don't you let the others have a turn? You don't want to show off, do you?" Sammy's stomach twisted. He wasn't trying to show off, he just wanted to help. As the days went by, Sammy's excitement for math class began to fade. Every time he raised his hand, Mrs. Andrews would sigh or roll her eyes. "Yes, Sammy?" she'd say in a tone that made him feel small. Sammy couldn't understand what he was doing wrong. He loved math, he loved learning, but Mrs. Andrews made him feel like he shouldn't. One day, after Sammy solved a tricky problem on the board, he heard Mrs. Andrews mutter, "Well, I suppose even a broken clock is right twice a day." Sammy's heart sank. He didn't know what that meant, but he could tell it wasn't nice. He slumped back to his seat, feeling confused and hurt. As the weeks passed, Sammy's classmates began to notice something wasn't quite right. They saw how Mrs. Andrews treated Sammy differently from the rest of them. When Sammy made a small mistake, like forgetting to carry a number in addition, Mrs. Andrews would shake her head and sigh loudly. "Sammy, you need to pay more attention," she'd say, her voice sharp. "This is basic math. You should know better by now." But when Sarah or Michael made the same mistake, Mrs. Andrews would smile kindly and say, "That's okay, sweetie. Let's try again together." The other kids looked at each other with confused expressions. They didn't understand why Mrs. Andrews was so hard on Sammy. He was always nice to everyone and tried his best in class. One day during recess, a group of Sammy's classmates huddled together whispering, "Did you see how Mrs. Andrews yelled at Sammy for dropping his pencil?" Lisa asked, her eyes wide. Tommy nodded. "Yeah, but when I spilled water all over my desk yesterday, she just helped me clean it up and didn't say anything mean." The children felt bad for Sammy, but they were afraid to speak up. Mrs. Andrews was their teacher after all. Who were they to question her? Sammy noticed his friends acting strange around him. They gave him sad looks and sometimes whispered when he walked by. It made him feel lonely and confused. He started to wonder if maybe he was doing something wrong without realizing it. At night, Sammy would lie in bed thinking hard about his day. "Maybe if I try even harder, Mrs. Andrews will like me," he thought. But no matter how much he studied or how carefully he followed the rules, nothing seemed to change. Still, Sammy tried to push these sad thoughts away. He loved learning too much to give up. Every morning he'd take a deep breath and tell himself, "Today will be better. I'll do my best, and that's what matters." But as he sat in class watching Mrs. Andrews praise his classmates while giving him cold looks, it got harder and harder to believe those words. As the math lesson progressed, Mrs. Andrews called Sammy to the blackboard. "Let's see if you can solve this problem, Sammy," she said, her voice tinged with doubt. Sammy took a deep breath and walked to the front of the class. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up the chalk. He looked at the problem on the board, a simple multiplication question. Sammy knew he could do this. He had practiced hard at home. Carefully, he wrote out the steps just like he'd learned. But as he neared the end, his nerves got the better of him. He made a small mistake, forgetting to carry over a number. Mrs. Andrews' eyes narrowed. "Oh, Sammy," she said, her voice loud and sharp. "How many times do we have to go over this? Can't you do anything right?" Sammy's cheeks burned red. He felt small and ashamed as he stood there, chalk still in hand. The whole class was watching. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Andrews," he mumbled, looking down at his shoes. "Sorry doesn't fix careless mistakes, Sammy," Mrs. Andrews continued. "Maybe if you paid more attention in class instead of daydreaming, you wouldn't embarrass yourself like this." The other students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They looked at each other, confusion and worry in their eyes. Why was Mrs. Andrews being so mean to Sammy? It was just a little mistake. Lisa raised her hand timidly. "Mrs. Andrews, I think I made the same mistake yesterday and you—" "That's enough, Lisa," Mrs. Andrews cut her off. "We're focusing on Sammy right now." Sammy's shoulders slumped as he made his way back to his desk. He felt like everyone was staring at him, thinking about how dumb he must be. Maybe Mrs. Andrews was right. Maybe he just wasn't good enough. As he sat down, Sammy tried to hold back the tears that threatened to spill from his eyes. He looked down at his math book, the numbers blurring together. In that moment, he felt more alone than ever before. As the weeks passed, the leaves on the trees outside the classroom window changed from green to vibrant oranges and reds. Inside, however, the atmosphere in Mrs. Andrews' class grew increasingly tense for young Sammy Holland. Each day, Sammy would enter the classroom with a glimmer of hope that things might be different. But as surely as the sun rose, Mrs. Andrews found ways to chip away at his confidence. During a group project, Sammy worked hard on his part, carefully coloring in a chart about fractions. When Mrs. Andrews walked by to check on everyone's progress, she paused at each desk. "Wonderful work, Emily," she beamed at the girl next to Sammy. "Your colors are so neat and tidy." Sammy's heart lifted. Surely she'd say something nice about his work too. But when Mrs. Andrews reached his desk, her smile faded. "Sammy," she sighed, shaking her head. "Couldn't you have at least tried to stay inside the lines? It looks so messy." Sammy's shoulders slumped. He had tried his best. He looked down at his chart, suddenly seeing all its flaws. In another instance, when the class took a math quiz, Mrs. Andrews handed back the papers with a flourish. "Class, I'm so proud of how well you all did," she announced. "Special mention to Jake for getting a perfect score." Jake grinned, accepting high fives from his friends. Sammy looked down at his own paper. He had only missed one question, scoring a 95%. His heart sank as Mrs. Andrews passed by without a word. As autumn turned to winter, Sammy's love for math began to freeze over like the pond in the schoolyard, where once he had eagerly raised his hand to answer questions, now he kept it firmly on his desk, afraid of making a mistake and facing Mrs. Andrews' disapproval. His parents noticed the change at home. "How was school today, champ?" his dad would ask. "Fine," Sammy would mumble, no longer excited to share what he'd learned. In class, Sammy tried to make himself as small as possible, hoping Mrs. Andrews wouldn't notice him. But somehow she always did, her critical eyes finding every little error. As the winter days grew shorter, the change in Sammy became impossible for Mr. and Mrs. Holland to ignore. Their once bubbly boy, who used to burst through the front door with stories about his day, now trudged in silently, his eyes downcast. One evening, as Sammy picked at his dinner, barely touching his favorite mashed potatoes, Mrs. Holland exchanged a worried glance with her husband. "Sammy, sweetie," she said gently, "is everything okay at school?" Sammy shrugged, pushing a pea around his plate with his fork. "It's fine," he mumbled. Mr. Holland leaned forward, his brow furrowed with concern. "You know you can talk to us about anything, champ. We've noticed you haven't been yourself lately." Sammy's lower lip trembled and he set his fork down. He looked up at his parents, his eyes brimming with tears. I think Mrs. Andrews doesn't like me," he whispered. Mrs. Holland's heart clenched. "What makes you think that, honey?" Sammy's words tumbled out in a rush. She's always pointing out my mistakes in front of everyone. She never says anything nice about my work, even when I try really hard. I don't know what I'm doing wrong." Mr. Holland reached across the table, placing his hand on Sammy's. "You're not doing anything wrong, son. Sometimes people just don't see how special we are." Mrs. Holland nodded, her voice soft but firm. "That's right, Sammy. And no matter what, we want you to keep trying your best. We're so proud of you, and we know how smart and capable you are." Sammy sniffled, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "But what if my best isn't good enough for Mrs. Andrews?" "Your best is always good enough," Mr. Holland said, squeezing Sammy's hand. "And we'll always be here to support you, no matter what." As the final bell rang, signaling the end of another school day, Sammy lingered in his seat. His classmates rushed out, eager to start their afternoon, but Sammy's heart raced with anxiety. He clutched his math notebook tightly, gathering the courage to approach Mrs. Andrews' desk. Taking a deep breath, Sammy stood up and walked to the front of the classroom. Mrs. Andrews was erasing the chalkboard, her back turned to him. "Mrs. Andrews?" Sammy's voice quivered. "Could I ask you a question about today's lesson?" Mrs. Andrews turned, her expression neutral. "What is it, Sammy?" Sammy opened his notebook, pointing to a problem he'd been struggling with. "I don't understand how to solve this one. Could you please explain it to me?" Mrs. Andrews glanced at the problem, then back at Sammy. Her lips tightened into a thin line. "Sammy, we went over this in class today. You should have been paying attention." Sammy's face fell. "I was trying to, but I got confused and—" "If you had been listening properly," Mrs. Andrews cut him off, "you wouldn't need to waste my time after class. I can't hold your hand through every little problem." Sammy's eyes stung with unshed tears. He nodded silently and closed his notebook. "Now, if you don't have any other questions, I have work to do," Mrs. Andrews said dismissively, turning back to the chalkboard. Sammy trudged back to his desk, his shoulders slumped. He slowly packed his bag, his mind racing with thoughts of failure and inadequacy. As he walked out of the classroom, he felt a heaviness in his chest that seemed to weigh him down with each step. In the empty hallway, Sammy leaned against a wall of lockers, trying to blink away the tears that threatened to spill. He had mustered up all his courage to ask for help, only to be brushed off and made to feel stupid. The excitement he once felt for math class had completely vanished. In its place was a growing sense of dread and self-doubt. Sammy wondered if he would ever be good enough in Mrs. Andrews' eyes, or if he was destined to always fall short. As the weeks passed, Sammy's once friendly classmates began to pull away from him. During lunch breaks, he found himself sitting alone more often than not. The other children, who used to eagerly include him in their games and conversations, now cast wary glances in his direction before huddling together in their own groups. One day, as Sammy approached a table where some of his former friends were sitting, he overheard a whispered conversation. "Shh! Here comes Sammy," one boy said, his eyes darting nervously. "Quick, act busy," another replied, suddenly becoming very interested in his sandwich. Sammy's heart sank as he realized they were deliberately avoiding him. He turned away, fighting back tears, and found an empty table in the corner of the cafeteria. As he ate his lunch in silence, Sammy couldn't help but wonder why his classmates were treating him this way. It dawned on him that they might be afraid of being associated with him, worried that Mrs. Andrews' harsh treatment would extend to them if they remained friendly with him. The loneliness began to seep into every aspect of Sammy's school life. In group projects, he was often the last one chosen, if chosen at all. During recess, he found himself wandering the playground alone, watching from afar as his peers laughed and played together. This isolation took its toll on Sammy's academic performance. His mind, once eager to learn, now struggled to focus in class. The constant worry of being singled out by Mrs. Andrews, coupled with the ache of loneliness, made it difficult for him to concentrate on his studies. In his other classes, where he had once excelled, Sammy's grades began to slip. His science teacher, Mr. Johnson, noticed the change and approached him after class one day. "Sammy, is everything all right?" Mr. Johnson asked gently. "I've noticed your grades have been dropping lately." Sammy shrugged, unable to meet his teacher's concerned gaze. I'm fine," he mumbled, even though he felt far from it. As Sammy walked home that afternoon, his backpack felt heavier than usual, weighed down by the burden of his struggles. The self-doubt that had taken root in Mrs. Andrews' class had now spread, making him question his abilities in all his subjects. As the school year progressed, Mrs. Andrews' subtle undermining of Sammy's confidence continued. One day, she announced a group activity for the math class. The students buzzed with excitement, eager to work with their friends. Sammy's heart raced, hoping this might be a chance to reconnect with his classmates. "All right, class," Mrs. Andrews said, her voice cutting through the chatter. "I'll be assigning the groups today." She began calling out names, and Sammy waited anxiously to hear his. When she finally reached him, his heart sank. "Sammy, you'll be working with Tommy and Lisa," Mrs. Andrews declared, gesturing to two students known to struggle with math. Sammy glanced at Tommy and Lisa, who looked just as uncomfortable as he felt. He knew they were kind, but they often needed extra help during math lessons. It was clear that Mrs. Andrews was implying Sammy was at their level. As the group settled into work, Sammy tried his best to stay positive. "Okay, guys," he said with a forced smile. "Let's tackle this problem together." But as they worked through the assignment, Mrs. Andrews hovered nearby, her presence a constant reminder of Sammy's perceived inadequacy. Every time Sammy attempted to explain a concept to his group members, Mrs. Andrews would interject. "Now, Sammy," she'd say, her tone laced with condescension, "are you sure that's the right approach? Perhaps you should let Tommy try." Each criticism chipped away at Sammy's resolve. He began to second-guess every answer, every suggestion he made to the group. The confidence he once had in his math abilities crumbled under Mrs. Andrews' relentless scrutiny. As the activity went on, Sammy's enthusiasm waned. He found himself withdrawing, letting Tommy and Lisa take the lead, even when he knew the answers. It seemed easier to stay quiet than to face Mrs. Andrews' disapproval. By the end of the class, Sammy felt deflated. The joy he once found in solving math problems had dimmed, replaced by a gnawing sense of inadequacy. As he packed up his books, he caught sight of the bright stickers on his math notebook, remnants of a time when he loved learning, when every solved equation felt like a triumph. Now those stickers seemed to mock him. Sammy's love for learning, once a vibrant flame, had faded to a mere flicker. As he left the classroom, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd ever feel that excitement for math or any subject ever again. Despite the challenges, Sammy's determination didn't completely waver. After another disheartening day at school, he sat at his small desk at home, surrounded by math textbooks and worksheets. His brow furrowed in concentration as he worked through problem after problem. "I can do this," Sammy whispered to himself, his pencil moving swiftly across the paper. "I just need to try harder." His mother, noticing the light still on in his room, peeked in. "Sammy, honey, it's getting late. Don't you want to watch your favorite show?" Sammy looked up, his eyes tired but determined. "Not tonight, Mom. I need to finish these math problems." Mrs. Holland's face softened with concern. She knew her son had been struggling in school lately, but seeing him push himself so hard tugged at her heart. "All right, sweetie. Don't stay up too late, okay?" Sammy nodded and returned to his work. Night after night, he pored over his math books, hoping that if he just studied enough, Mrs. Andrews would finally see his potential. The next day in class, Sammy's hand shot up eagerly when Mrs. Andrews asked a question. "Yes, Sammy?" she said, her tone already tinged with skepticism. "The answer is 42, Sammy replied confidently, having practiced similar problems the night before. Mrs. Andrews pursed her lips. "Well, Sammy, that's correct, but you didn't show your work on the board. How can we be sure you didn't just guess?" Sammy's face fell. He had been so excited to answer correctly that he forgot to write out the steps. I can show you now," he offered hesitantly. "No need." Mrs. Andrews dismissed him with a wave. "Let's have someone else demonstrate the proper way to solve the problem." As another student went to the board, Sammy slumped in his seat. No matter how hard he tried, it seemed Mrs. Andrews always found something to criticize. The constant disapproval was slowly chipping away at his self-esteem. Yet as Sammy walked home that afternoon, a small spark of hope still flickered within him. Maybe tomorrow would be different. Maybe if he studied even harder, Mrs. Andrews would finally see how much he was trying. Despite the unfair treatment, Sammy remained hopeful that things would improve. As the school year drew to a close, a mix of excitement and anxiety filled the air. Students chattered about summer plans, but Sammy Holland felt a knot in his stomach. Report card day loomed, and despite his tireless efforts, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread. When Mrs. Andrews handed out the sealed envelopes, Sammy's hands trembled as he took his. He waited until he was alone to open it, his heart pounding. As his eyes scanned the page, his hopes crumbled. The grades were lower than he'd expected, far lower than he felt he deserved. Tears welled up in Sammy's eyes. All those late nights studying, all the extra practice problems he'd done. It felt like none of it had mattered. Mrs. Andrews' comments were polite but cool, noting that Sammy needed improvement in several areas. Sammy's shoulders slumped as he walked home, the weight of disappointment heavy on his small frame. He'd tried so hard, pushed himself to the limit, and still, it wasn't enough. For a moment, he considered giving up. What was the point of trying if no one saw his efforts? But as he sat on his bed staring at the report card, something stirred within Sammy. A quiet determination began to take root. He thought about how it felt to be overlooked, to have his potential dismissed. He thought about other kids who might be feeling the same way. In that moment, Sammy made a silent vow to himself. One day he would become a teacher, but not just any teacher. He would be the kind of teacher who saw the best in every student. He would encourage, uplift, and inspire. No child in his class would ever feel the way Mrs. Andrews had made him feel. Sammy's eyes shone with renewed purpose. He might not be able to change Mrs. Andrews' opinion of him, but he could use this experience to fuel his future. He would work hard, persevere, and one day, he would make a difference in children's lives. Years had passed, and Sammy Holland stood at the front of his own classroom, a warm smile on his face as he watched his students file in for the day. The walls were adorned with colorful posters and inspiring quotes, creating a welcoming atmosphere that felt worlds apart from the cold, intimidating classroom of his childhood. As the last student took their seat, Sammy's eyes swept across the room, taking in each eager face. He saw potential in every child, regardless of their background or abilities. This was more than just a job for Sammy, it was his calling. "Good morning, everyone," Sammy said, his voice gentle but filled with enthusiasm. "Today we're going to tackle some challenging math problems. But remember, it's not about getting everything right on the first try. It's about learning and growing together." As he began the lesson, Sammy moved around the room, offering encouragement and support to each student. When little Emily struggled with a problem, Sammy knelt beside her desk, his voice low and patient as he guided her through the steps. The smile that lit up her face when she finally understood was all the reward Sammy needed. Later, during a quiet moment while the students worked independently, Sammy's mind drifted back to his own school days. He remembered the sting of Mrs. Andrews' dismissive words, the way her subtle discrimination had chipped away at his confidence. But instead of bitterness, Sammy felt a profound sense of gratitude. Those painful experiences had shaped him, molding him into the teacher he was today. Every kind word he spoke, every patient explanation he gave, was a direct response to the treatment he had received as a child. Sammy had turned his pain into purpose, his disappointment into determination. He looked around at his classroom, at the students bent over their work with furrowed brows and hopeful expressions. In each of them, he saw a bit of himself, that eager young boy who had just wanted to learn and be valued. And in himself, he saw the teacher he had always wished for. The next day, Sammy stood in his living room, staring at the envelope in his hands. The return address bore the name of his old elementary school, stirring a mix of emotions within him. With trembling fingers, he opened it and pulled out a glossy invitation to the school's reunion. As he read the details, memories of his time in Mrs. Andrews' class came flooding back. The subtle discrimination, the constant criticism, the feeling of never being good enough. It all rushed over him like a tidal wave. Sammy's heart raced and he found himself sinking onto the couch, the invitation still clutched tightly in his hand. "Do I really want to go back there?" he whispered to himself, his voice thick with emotion. The thought of seeing Mrs. Andrews again made his stomach churn. What if she was still the same? What if those old feelings of inadequacy resurfaced? For days, Sammy wrestled with the decision. He'd catch himself staring at the invitation on his kitchen counter, torn between the desire to avoid potential pain and the curiosity about how his old classmates had fared over the years. One evening, as he graded papers in his classroom, Sammy's eyes fell on a framed quote on his desk. "Be the change you wish to see in the world." He'd placed it there as a daily reminder of his mission as a teacher. Suddenly, a realization washed over him. By avoiding the reunion, wasn't he letting his past experiences continue to hold power over him? Hadn't he spent years working to become the teacher he wished he'd had? Maybe this was his chance to show Mrs. Andrews and himself just how far he'd come. With a deep breath, Sammy picked up his phone and called the number on the invitation. "Yes, I'd like to RSVP for the reunion," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. As he hung up, Sammy felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He was no longer that insecure little boy. He was Sammy Holland, a respected teacher who had turned his pain into purpose. The evening of the reunion arrived, and Sammy found himself standing at the entrance of his old elementary school. He took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and stepped inside. The hallways were filled with familiar faces, now older but still recognizable. As Sammy made his way to the gymnasium, he heard someone call out, "Sammy? Sammy Holland, is that you?" He turned to see Sarah, one of his old classmates, beaming at him. Soon, a small group gathered around him, exchanging warm greetings and excited chatter. They moved to a quiet corner of the gym, catching up on years gone by. Laughter filled the air as they shared stories of their lives since elementary school. Sammy felt a warmth in his chest, realizing how much he had missed these connections. As the night wore on, the conversation inevitably turned to their shared experiences in school. "Remember Mrs. Andrews' class?" Tom, another former classmate, asked. The group grew quiet, exchanging meaningful glances. Sarah spoke up, her voice soft. "Sammy, we always noticed how Mrs. Andrews treated you differently. It wasn't fair." Sammy felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't expected his old classmates to bring this up, let alone remember it so clearly. "Yeah," Mark chimed in. "She was always so hard on you, even when you got things right. It was like she had it out for you or something." The others nodded in agreement, expressions of sympathy on their faces. Sammy was touched by their concern, even after all these years. "How did you do it, Sammy?" Sarah asked, leaning forward. "How did you manage to become so successful despite everything Mrs. Andrews put you through?" Sammy paused, considering his response. He looked around at the expectant faces of his former classmates, all waiting to hear how he had overcome the unfair treatment he'd endured. Sammy took a moment to gather his thoughts, his eyes misting over as he looked at his former classmates. Their concern and understanding touched him deeply. I didn't know you all noticed," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Back then, I thought I was alone in feeling that way." Sarah reached out and squeezed his hand. "We were just kids, Sammy. We didn't know how to help, but we saw it. We all did." As Sammy listened to his classmates share their memories, a wave of emotions washed over him. There was a sense of validation. Finally, confirmation that he hadn't imagined or exaggerated the unfair treatment. But with it came a profound sadness for the little boy he once was, struggling to understand why his teacher seemed to dislike him so much. "It was hard," Sammy admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "There were days I didn't want to go to school, but I guess in a way it made me stronger. It made me want to be better." As the group continued their conversation, none of them noticed the elderly woman who had paused near their circle. Mrs. Andrews, now retired and gray-haired, stood frozen, her hand clutching her punch cup tightly. She had come to the reunion expecting to reminisce about her years of teaching, to see how her former students had grown. Instead, she found herself confronted with the painful reality of the harm she had caused. As she listened to Sammy and his classmates discuss her treatment of him, Mrs. Andrews felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. The realization of the pain she had inflicted on young Sammy hit her like a physical blow. Memories flooded back, times she had dismissed Sammy's raised hand, moments she had criticized him more harshly than others. At the time, she had justified her actions to herself, never acknowledging the bias that drove them. Now, hearing the hurt in Sammy's voice and the concern in his classmates' words, she couldn't deny the truth any longer. Mrs. Andrews' hands began to shake, causing her punch to spill onto the floor. The noise drew the attention of Sammy and his friends, who turned to see their former teacher standing there, her face pale and eyes wide with shock and remorse. Mrs. Andrews stood rooted to the spot, her hands trembling as she held her now empty punch cup. The weight of her past actions crashed down upon her, leaving her breathless and ashamed. She had never allowed herself to fully confront the impact of her behavior on young Sammy, always finding ways to justify her actions. But now, hearing his classmates discuss it so openly, she could no longer hide from the truth. The retired teacher's mind raced with memories of how she had treated Sammy, the dismissive tones, the harsh criticisms, the subtle ways she had undermined his confidence. Each recollection felt like a knife twisting in her heart. How could she have been so blind to her own prejudices? As the reality of her actions sank in, Mrs. Andrews felt a deep, gnawing guilt that threatened to overwhelm her. She had failed not just as a teacher, but as a human being. The harm she had inflicted on Sammy was undeniable, and the thought of facing him now filled her with dread. Her eyes darted nervous light at Sammy, who was now looking at her with a mix of surprise and uncertainty. Mrs. Andrews braced herself, expecting, perhaps even believing she deserved, a public dressing down. After all, wasn't that what she had subjected Sammy to all those years ago? She imagined Sammy standing up, pointing an accusing finger at her, and laying bare all her faults for everyone to see. In her mind, she could almost hear him detailing every slight, every unfair criticism, every moment of undeserved shame she had heaped upon him. The imagined scene was so vivid that Mrs. Andrews flinched, as if physically struck by the force of Sammy's potential words. Her heart raced as she waited for the moment when Sammy would unleash years of pent-up hurt and anger. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly deserving of whatever humiliation was to come. As Sammy approached Mrs. Andrews, her heart pounded in her chest. She stood rigid, her hands clasped tightly together, bracing herself for the worst. The retired teacher was certain that years of pent-up anger and hurt were about to be unleashed upon her. She closed her eyes briefly, steeling herself for the public humiliation she felt she deserved. But when Sammy reached her, his voice was warm and gentle. "Mrs. Andrews," he said, a soft smile on his face. "It's been a long time. How have you been?" Mrs. Andrews' eyes flew open in surprise. She stared at Sammy, searching his face for any sign of the bitterness or resentment she had expected. Instead, she found only kindness in his eyes. The composure with which he carried himself left her momentarily speechless. I'm well, thank you," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. She couldn't understand how Sammy could greet her so warmly after everything she had put him through. The guilt that had been gnawing at her intensified, making her feel even more undeserving of his kindness. Sammy nodded, his smile never wavering. "I'm glad to hear that. You know, I've thought about you often over the years." Mrs. Andrews felt her cheeks flush with shame. She had thought about Sammy too, but always with a mixture of regret and denial. Now, faced with his unexpected grace, she found herself at a loss for words. "Sammy, she began, her voice cracking with emotion. But before she could continue, Sammy gently placed a hand on her arm. "It's okay, Mrs. Andrews," he said softly. "We all have things in our past we wish we could change. What matters is how we move forward." Mrs. Andrews felt tears welling up in her eyes as she listened to Sammy speak. His words were filled with a sincerity that touched her deeply. "Mrs. Andrews," Sammy began, his voice gentle but firm, "I won't pretend that my time in your class was easy. There were days when I felt so small, so insignificant." He paused, taking a deep breath. Mrs. Andrews flinched, expecting the worst, but Sammy's next words surprised her. "But you know what? Those experiences shaped me. They made me who I am today." Mrs. Andrews looked at him, confusion evident in her eyes. Sammy continued, "I decided that no child should ever feel the way I did. So I became a teacher, Mrs. Andrews. A teacher who sees the potential in every student, who lifts them up instead of tearing them down." His words were like a balm and a blade all at once, soothing yet cutting deep into Mrs. Andrews' conscience. "In my classroom, every child knows they're valued," Sammy said, his eyes shining with pride. "When a student struggles, I remember how it felt to be in their shoes. I use that memory to guide them, to show them that they're capable of greatness." Mrs. Andrews felt a lump forming in her throat. She wanted to speak, to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. Sammy smiled softly. "I won't lie and say it was easy. There were times when I wanted to give up. But then, I'd think about the teacher I wished I had, and that gave me the strength to keep going." As Sammy spoke, Mrs. Andrews saw not the timid boy from her class, but a confident, compassionate man. A teacher who had taken the pain from his past and turned it into a force for good. "So in a way, Mrs. Andrews," Sammy concluded, his voice warm and free of any bitterness, "I have you to thank. Your class taught me the kind of teacher I wanted to be, by showing me the kind I didn't want to be." Mrs. Andrews stood there overwhelmed by Sammy's words. The forgiveness and understanding in his voice were more than she had ever expected or felt she deserved. Mrs. Andrews felt her chest tighten as she struggled to find the right words. Her eyes, brimming with tears, met Sammy's compassionate gaze. "Sammy," she began, her voice trembling, I don't know where to begin. What I did to you was inexcusable." She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "I allowed my own biases and frustrations to cloud my judgment. I treated you unfairly, and I deeply regret the pain I caused you." Mrs. Andrews wiped a tear from her cheek. "I was supposed to nurture and encourage you, but instead, I tore you down. I failed you as a teacher and as a human being. I'm so sorry, Sammy." Sammy listened intently, his expression softening with each word. Mrs. Andrews' apology hung in the air between them, heavy with years of unspoken pain and regret. After a moment, Sammy spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "Mrs. Andrews, thank you for your apology. It means a lot to hear you acknowledge what happened." He took a deep breath before continuing. "You know, for years I carried the weight of those experiences with me, but I've learned that holding on to that pain only hurts me more." Sammy's eyes met Mrs. Andrews, filled with a wisdom beyond his years. "People can change and grow, Mrs. Andrews. I've seen it in my own students, and I see it in you now. Your apology shows that you've reflected on your actions and want to do better." Mrs. Andrews nodded, tears flowing freely now. Sammy continued, "I accept your apology, not just for my sake, but for yours too. We all deserve the chance to learn from our mistakes and become better people." As the reunion continued around them, Sammy and Mrs. Andrews found a quiet corner to continue their conversation. The buzz of laughter and chatter faded into the background as they delved deeper into their shared past and the impact it had on both their lives. Mrs. Andrews leaned forward, her eyes filled with a mix of regret and hope. "Sammy, I can't change what I did, but I want to understand. Can you tell me more about how my actions affected you?" Sammy nodded, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. "It was tough," he admitted. "For a long time, I doubted myself. I thought maybe I just wasn't smart enough or good enough. But as I grew older, I realized that those feelings came from how I was treated, not from who I was." Mrs. Andrews listened intently, her heart heavy with each word. Sammy continued, "That's why I became a teacher. I wanted to make sure no child ever felt the way I did in your class." His words struck a chord with Mrs. Andrews. She realized the profound impact teachers could have on their students' lives, for better or worse. "Sammy, you've turned a painful experience into something beautiful. You're the kind of teacher I should have been." Sammy smiled softly. "We all have room to grow, Mrs. Andrews. What matters is that we recognize our mistakes and try to do better." Mrs. Andrews nodded, her eyes shining with determination. You're absolutely right, Sammy. I want to make amends. Is there any way I can support your mission of empowering students? Sammy was touched by her sincerity. He could see the genuine desire for redemption in her eyes. As they continued their conversation, Sammy's eyes lit up with an idea. He leaned forward, his voice filled with excitement. Mrs. Andrews, I think we have a real opportunity here. What if we could turn our shared past into something positive? Mrs. Andrews looked at him curiously. What do you mean, Sammy? Well, Sammy explained, I've been thinking about opening a community center, a place where we could offer free tutoring for kids who can't afford extra help. We could make a real difference in their lives. Mrs. Andrews' eyes widened with interest. That sounds wonderful, Sammy, but how would we do it? Sammy's enthusiasm was contagious. We could start small, maybe use the old community hall on weekends. We could recruit volunteer tutors, create study materials, and reach out to local schools to find students who need help. As Sammy spoke, Mrs. Andrews felt a surge of inspiration. Here was a chance to make amends, to use her years of teaching experience for good. Sammy, I think that's a brilliant idea, and I'd like to help if you'll have me. Sammy's face broke into a warm smile. Really? That would be amazing, Mrs. Andrews. Your experience would be invaluable. Mrs. Andrews nodded, her eyes shining with determination. Yes, I want to do this. It's time I used my skills to uplift students, the way I always should have. Together, they began to brainstorm ideas for their new venture. Sammy grabbed a napkin from the refreshment table and started jotting down notes. Mrs. Andrews chimed in with suggestions about curriculum and teaching methods. As they planned, both felt a sense of excitement and purpose. What had once been a painful chapter in their lives was now becoming the foundation for something beautiful and meaningful. Their shared goal of helping students brought them together in a way neither could have imagined. Sammy and Mrs. Andrews threw themselves into their new project with enthusiasm. They spent long hours planning, making phone calls, and meeting with local officials to bring their vision to life. The old community hall, once neglected, began to buzz with activity as they prepared it for its new purpose. Sammy's natural charisma and Mrs. Andrews' years of experience proved to be a powerful combination. They approached local businesses for donations, explaining their mission with passion. Many were moved by their story of reconciliation and growth, eagerly offering support. As word spread about their initiative, volunteers began to come forward. Former students of both Sammy and Mrs. Andrews were among the first to sign up, touched by the idea of giving back to their community. The unlikely partnership between Sammy and his former teacher intrigued many, drawing even more attention to their cause. Mrs. Andrews took charge of developing the curriculum, carefully crafting lessons that would engage and inspire young minds. Sammy focused on creating a welcoming environment, ensuring that every child who walked through their doors would feel valued and supported. The community's response was overwhelmingly positive. Parents expressed gratitude for the free tutoring service, and local schools eagerly partnered with them to identify students who could benefit from extra help. The center quickly became a beacon of hope for many families struggling to provide educational support for their children. As the opening day approached, Sammy couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. What had started as a conversation at a school reunion had blossomed into something truly special. He watched as Mrs. Andrews guided a group of volunteers through a training session, her eyes shining with purpose. It was clear that she, too, had found healing in this new chapter of her life. The transformation of their relationship from one of pain to one of collaboration and shared purpose was not lost on either of them. They often exchanged glances of mutual respect and understanding as they worked side by side, turning their dream into reality. As the community center neared completion, Sammy stood in the doorway of the main tutoring room, his eyes taking in the colorful posters and neatly arranged desks. A warm feeling of pride swelled in his chest. He couldn't help but think back to his days in Mrs. Andrews' classroom, where he had felt so small and insignificant. "Look how far we've come," he whispered to himself, running his hand along the smooth surface of a nearby desk. Sammy's mind drifted to the countless hours he had spent doubting himself as a child, the tears he had shed in frustration, and the dreams he had almost given up on. Now, here he was, creating a space where every child would feel valued and supported. It was more than just a building. It was a promise to his younger self and to every child who had ever felt left behind. Across the room, Mrs. Andrews was arranging books on a shelf, her movements careful and deliberate. Sammy watched her for a moment, marveling at how their relationship had transformed. The woman who had once been the source of his deepest insecurities was now his partner in this incredible journey. Mrs. Andrews turned, catching Sammy's eye. She smiled, a genuine warmth radiating from her face that Sammy never would have thought possible years ago. In that smile, Sammy saw not just Mrs. Andrews, but a woman who had found renewed purpose in her life. "Sammy," she called out, her voice soft with emotion, "I can't tell you how much this means to me, to be able to make things right, to help children in the way I should have helped you. It's given me a reason to get up every morning." Sammy walked over to her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We're both healing through this," he said, "and we're going to help so many kids along the way." As they stood there, surrounded by the promise of new beginnings, Sammy felt a deep sense of fulfillment wash over him. He had taken the pain of his past and turned it into something beautiful, something that would touch countless lives. And Mrs. Andrews, standing beside him, was living proof that people could change, grow, and find redemption. The grand opening day of the community center arrived, and Sammy could hardly believe his eyes. A long line of families stretched down the block, eagerly waiting to enter. Children of all ages clutched their parents' hands, their faces a mix of excitement and nervousness. As Sammy cut the ribbon, officially opening the doors, he felt a lump form in his throat. This was it, the moment he had been working towards for so long. Mrs. Andrews stood beside him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of joy. "Welcome, everyone," Sammy called out, his voice filled with warmth. "We're so happy to have you here." The families poured in, filling the center with chatter and laughter. Sammy and Mrs. Andrews moved through the crowd, greeting parents and kneeling down to speak with children at eye level. They explained the various programs and resources available, their enthusiasm infectious. In the main tutoring room, Sammy sat down with a young boy who reminded him so much of himself at that age. The child's eyes were wide with wonder as Sammy patiently explained a math problem, using colorful blocks to make the concept more tangible. Across the room, Mrs. Andrews was working with a small group of students, her gentle voice guiding them through a reading exercise. Sammy caught her eye, and they shared a smile. It was a moment of understanding. They were exactly where they needed to be. As the day progressed, the center buzzed with activity. In one corner, a volunteer helped a teenager with her science homework. In another, a group of younger children gathered for a storytelling session. Parents sat in on workshops about supporting their children's education at home. By the end of the day, Sammy and Mrs. Andrews were exhausted but exhilarated. They had helped so many families, offered hope and support to those who needed it most. The center had truly become a beacon of light in the community, a place where everyone was welcome and valued. As weeks went by, the community center blossomed into a vibrant hub of learning and growth. Sammy and Mrs. Andrews found themselves working side by side, their partnership growing stronger with each passing day. The once strained relationship between teacher and student had transformed into a powerful alliance dedicated to uplifting others. Mrs. Andrews, who had carried the weight of guilt for so long, began to find healing in her work at the center. Each time she helped a struggling student grasp a difficult concept, she felt a small piece of her past regret melt away. The joy in the children's eyes when they succeeded reminded her of the teacher she had always wanted to be. "Look at this, Sammy," Mrs. Andrews said one afternoon, her voice filled with excitement. She held up a math worksheet covered in neat, correct answers. Jenny finally understood fractions. She was so proud of herself. Sammy beamed, sharing in Mrs. Andrews' enthusiasm. "That's wonderful. I remember how much Jenny struggled with that last week. Your patience really paid off." As they worked together, Sammy found himself learning from Mrs. Andrews' years of experience. Her methods, now free from bias and filled with compassion, offered valuable insights. In turn, Sammy's fresh perspective and innovative teaching techniques inspired Mrs. Andrews to adapt her approach. For Sammy, the connection he felt with his students ran deep. In their faces, he often saw reflections of his younger self, eager to learn but sometimes doubting their abilities. He made it his mission to nurture their confidence and passion for learning. One day, as Sammy helped a young boy named Marcus with a reading assignment, he noticed the child's frustration. "I can't do it," Marcus mumbled, his head hanging low. Sammy gently placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You know, Marcus, I felt the same way when I was your age, but I promise you, with practice and belief in yourself, you can do anything." The boy looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "Really? You had trouble too?" Sammy nodded, sharing a bit of his own story. As he spoke, he saw Mrs. Andrews watching from across the room, her eyes filled with a mix of admiration and remorse. In that moment, they both realized how far they had come and the positive impact they were making together. One sunny afternoon, a young boy named Jamie timidly entered the community center. His eyes were wide with a mix of curiosity and nervousness as he clutched his backpack tightly to his chest. Mrs. Andrews noticed him immediately, and something about the boy's demeanor struck a chord deep within her. As Jamie approached the registration desk, Mrs. Andrews felt a wave of déjà vu wash over her. The boy's bright, eager eyes and slightly hesitant posture reminded her so much of Sammy at that age. It was like looking at a ghost from her past, a living reminder of the mistakes she had made and the opportunity she now had to make things right. "Hello there," Mrs. Andrews said softly, kneeling down to Jamie's eye level. "I'm Mrs. Andrews. What's your name?" Jamie, the boy stuttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Andrews smiled warmly. "Well, Jamie, we're so glad you're here. Can you tell me what subjects you'd like help with?" Jamie's eyes darted around the room before settling back on Mrs. Andrews. "Math," he mumbled. "I'm not very good at it." Those words hit Mrs. Andrews like a punch to the gut. How many times had she heard Sammy say something similar, only to dismiss his concerns? She made a silent vow right then and there to give Jamie all the support and encouragement she had failed to provide Sammy. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Andrews took Jamie under her wing. She worked with him patiently, breaking down complex problems into manageable steps. She praised his efforts and celebrated every small victory, no matter how minor it seemed. As the days passed, Jamie began to blossom under Mrs. Andrews' guidance. His confidence grew, and soon he was tackling problems that would have overwhelmed him before. The shy, hesitant boy who had first entered the center was transforming before her eyes. One day, as Jamie successfully solved a particularly tricky equation, Mrs. Andrews felt tears welling up in her eyes. She watched as Jamie's face lit up with pride, his smile bright enough to light up the entire room. "I did it, Mrs. Andrews," Jamie exclaimed, his voice filled with excitement. "I really did it." Mrs. Andrews nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of joy and bittersweet regret. "You certainly did, Jamie. I'm so proud of you." As Jamie's success story spread, the community began to take notice of the remarkable transformations happening at the center. Parents whispered excitedly at school pickup lines, sharing stories of their children's newfound enthusiasm for learning. Word of mouth traveled quickly through the small town, and soon more families were seeking out the center's services. One crisp autumn afternoon, Sammy stood at the entrance of the community center, marveling at the line of eager students and parents stretching down the block. He felt a warmth spread through his chest as he watched Mrs. Andrews greet each family with a kind smile and a welcoming word. "I never imagined it would grow like this," Sammy said softly to himself, shaking his head in wonder. As the center's reputation grew, local news outlets began to take an interest. A reporter from the town newspaper visited one day, scribbling notes furiously as she observed the bustling activity. She interviewed several students and parents, all of whom sang praises of Sammy and Mrs. Andrews. "They're like guardian angels," one mother gushed, wiping away a tear. "My son used to hate school. Now he can't wait to come here every day." The resulting article painted Sammy and Mrs. Andrews as local heroes, highlighting their dedication and the positive impact they were having on the community. When the newspaper hit the stands, the phone at the center rang off the hook with calls from people wanting to volunteer or donate. Despite the growing acclaim, both Sammy and Mrs. Andrews remained humble about their roles. At a town council meeting where they were being honored, Sammy stood up and addressed the crowd. "We appreciate your kind words," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "But the real heroes are the students who come to us every day, ready to learn and grow. And let's not forget the parents, volunteers, and everyone in this community who has supported us. This center's success is a testament to what we can achieve when we all work together." Mrs. Andrews nodded in agreement, adding, "We're just two people. It's the collective effort of this entire community that's making the real difference." As the first year of the community center drew to a close, Sammy and Mrs. Andrews decided to organize a celebration to honor the students' achievements. They spent weeks planning every detail, from decorations to refreshments, wanting to make the day special for everyone involved. On the day of the celebration, the center buzzed with excitement. Colorful balloons and streamers adorned the walls, and a large banner reading, "Congratulations, students," hung proudly over the entrance. Families streamed in, their faces beaming with pride as they admired the displays of student work lining the hallways. Sammy stood near the door, greeting each person with a warm smile and a handshake. His heart swelled as he watched the room fill with familiar faces. Students who had once struggled, but now stood tall with newfound confidence. Mrs. Andrews, meanwhile, flitted from group to group, offering words of praise and encouragement to each student. Her eyes shone with unshed tears as she listened to parents share stories of their children's progress. As the room quieted down, Sammy stepped up to the makeshift stage they had set up. "Welcome, everyone," he began, his voice filled with emotion. "We're here today to celebrate not just academic achievements, but personal growth, determination, and the power of community." After Sammy's opening remarks, it was Mrs. Andrews' turn to speak. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she approached the microphone. The room fell silent, all eyes on the woman who had once been known for her stern demeanor. "First, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here today," Mrs. Andrews began, her voice wavering slightly. "As many of you know, I haven't always been the teacher I should have been. I made mistakes, allowed my biases to cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I failed some of my students." She paused, her gaze finding Sammy in the crowd. He nodded encouragingly, and she continued. "But standing here today, seeing all the wonderful things happening in this center, I'm filled with hope and gratitude. I'm committed to making a difference, to ensuring that every child feels valued and supported in their learning journey." As Mrs. Andrews spoke, many in the audience wiped away tears. Her words, honest and heartfelt, touched everyone present. She concluded her speech by expressing her deep appreciation for the students, their families, and the community that had embraced the center's mission. As the months passed, the community center continued to flourish under Sammy and Mrs. Andrews' guidance. They worked tirelessly to expand their services, always looking for new ways to support the families they served. One afternoon, as they sat in the center's small office, Sammy proposed an idea. "What if we started offering workshops for parents?" he suggested, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. "We could help them better support their children's learning at home." Mrs. Andrews nodded, a warm smile spreading across her face. "That's brilliant, Sammy. And maybe we could add some additional programs for the students too. Art classes, perhaps? Or music lessons?" Their ideas flowed freely, each suggestion building on the last. As they talked, both Sammy and Mrs. Andrews felt a deep sense of gratitude for their unlikely partnership. What had begun as a chance for redemption had blossomed into a genuine friendship and a shared mission. Over the next few weeks, they put their plans into action. The center buzzed with new energy as parents attended evening workshops on topics like supporting your child's reading and making math fun at home. The children's eyes sparkled with excitement as they explored new interests in the after-school art and music programs. One day, as they watched a group of students working together on a colorful mural, Mrs. Andrews turned to Sammy. "You know," she said softly, "I never could have imagined this when we first met at the reunion. Look at what we've created together." Sammy nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "It's pretty amazing, isn't it?" We've taken something painful from the past and turned it into something beautiful and lasting." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the children laugh and create. Both felt a profound sense of fulfillment, knowing that their work was making a real difference in the lives of these families. As the center grew, so did the bond between Sammy and Mrs. Andrews. They found themselves sharing not just their work, but their lives. They celebrated each other's birthdays, shared stories of their families, and supported one another through challenges. As the community center continued to thrive, Mrs. Andrews found herself reflecting on the incredible journey she and Sammy had taken together. One quiet afternoon, she decided it was time to express her gratitude in a tangible way. Mrs. Andrews carefully wrapped a small package, her hands trembling slightly with emotion. She made her way to Sammy's office, where he was busy reviewing some paperwork. Knocking gently, she entered with a warm smile. "Sammy, do you have a moment?" she asked softly. Sammy looked up, his face brightening at the sight of his friend and colleague. "Of course, Mrs. Andrews. What's on your mind?" Mrs. Andrews approached his desk, holding out the carefully wrapped package. "I have something for you," she said, her voice filled with warmth. Sammy took the gift, a curious expression on his face. As he unwrapped it, his eyes widened in surprise. Inside was a beautifully framed photograph of the two of them, taken at the center's opening ceremony. In the picture, they stood side by side, their faces beaming with pride and hope. "Oh, Mrs. Andrews," Sammy whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He traced the edge of the frame with his finger, taking in every detail of the image. Mrs. Andrews watched him, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I thought it was time we had a reminder of how far we've come," she explained, "from where we started to where we are now. It's quite a journey, isn't it?" Sammy nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The photo captured so much more than just a single moment in time. It represented their shared path from pain to healing, from teacher and student to partners in making a difference. Finally, finding his voice, Sammy looked up at Mrs. Andrews. "Thank you," he said softly. "This means more to me than I can express." Mrs. Andrews placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It means a great deal to me too, Sammy. I never imagined we'd be here, working side by side, changing lives together." They stood in comfortable silence, both gazing at the photograph. The moment was filled with quiet reflection, each lost in thoughts of their remarkable journey. As the community center's one-year anniversary celebration began, the room buzzed with excitement. Colorful balloons and streamers adorned the walls, and smiling faces filled every corner. Sammy Holland stood at the front, his heart full of pride and gratitude. Taking a deep breath, Sammy stepped up to the microphone. His eyes scanned the crowd, landing on Mrs. Andrews, who sat in the front row. She gave him an encouraging nod, her eyes shining with emotion. "Friends, students, and community members," Sammy began, his voice warm and clear. "1 year ago, we opened these doors with a dream of creating a place where every child feels valued and supported." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "That dream has become a reality thanks to all of you. But there's one person I'd like to thank especially." Sammy's gaze returned to Mrs. Andrews. "Mrs. Andrews, would you please join me up here?" Surprised, Mrs. Andrews made her way to the stage. Sammy took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Mrs. Andrews and I have come a long way," Sammy continued, his voice thick with emotion. "From my days as her student to now, working side by side, her dedication to our shared mission has been nothing short of inspiring." Mrs. Andrews stood beside Sammy, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The community members watched in rapt attention, many nodding in agreement. "Together we've learned that it's never too late to make a difference," Sammy said. "Mrs. Andrews, thank you for joining me on this incredible journey. Your commitment to our students and this center has touched countless lives." As Sammy spoke, Mrs. Andrews felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She looked out at the crowd, seeing the faces of students she had helped, parents she had supported, and community members who had embraced her. The redemption she had found in this work filled her heart with joy. Sammy concluded his speech, his voice ringing with hope and determination. As we celebrate this milestone, let's remember that our work is far from over. This center stands as a testament to what we can achieve when we come together, forgive, and dedicate ourselves to making a difference. The room erupted in applause, with many attendees rising to their feet. Mrs. Andrews, now fully redeemed and beloved by the community, stood proudly beside Sammy, watching as his dream continued to flourish before their very eyes. If you enjoyed the story of Sammy and Mrs. Andrews, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.